Hi, Keith here, and welcome to the review of our first year of our solar and battery installation. It's been a year of amazing performance, really annoying glitches and faults, but after a year, have we made the right decision on installing a solar panel array that faces east and west? So why did we go down the solar and battery route? This was the slide I put up in my first video, looking at the costs that we'd seen in the prior year and the price increases we would have seen on our then current usage. And for context, we live in a 3-bed detached house. We've got 3 adults and 1 teenager. I work from home pretty much full time, so there's usually someone in the house with running PCs, TVs, dishwasher, tumble dryer, which is obviously more in the autumn and winter, and washing machines. So standard items running in the house. Our fixed tariff ended in January 2022, and we went on to the standard variable rate because there were no viable fixed rates available. So for our last full year on the fixed rate, we used 6,351 kilowatt hours of electricity, or 6.3 megawatts, and that cost us £1,141.67. By going on to the standard variable rate, for the same usage, our annual charge based on last year's usage would have theoretically increased only by £192. But then, when the cost of electricity started to significantly increase, due to the price cap now being calculated every quarter in the UK, our theoretical annual bill then increased by £757 per annum. And at one point, before the government revised the cap that was applied in October 2022, we were looking at a theoretical annual bill 3 times the amount of the cost of 2021 and 2022. So in October 22, when I released the first video, I calculated that without solar, we were looking at a theoretical bill that had doubled on the previous year. And at that time, solar installations were becoming a more attractive proposition because the constant price increases meant the return on investment had probably halved just through the price increases of the previous months. But our main concern was whether a solar and battery installation would work based on the way our house is orientated. And this is the reason why. We have a south facing garden and it is a sun trap. However, as you can see from this photo, the ridge of our house runs north to south and we have the gable end at the back of the house facing south. So this means our roof pitches are facing west and east. However, these pitches aren't really obscured. We're not surrounded by buildings that will block the sun on those roofs, and while we have a large magnolia tree in the back garden to the west side of the house, it is regularly pruned and kept to size, as you can see in the photo where it had been pruned from the autumn before. And in terms of where we're positioned, apart from our neighbours to the east, the west side of our house doesn't really have anything to block the view of the sun. All the houses around us are similar build, similar height, and are spaced apart. Also notice that we're not exactly east-west facing, and this is important when you look at the path the sun takes during the course of the year, which we'll come to shortly. And for context, the UK is actually a lot further north than some people realise. So the southeast of the UK is between 51 to 52 degrees north in terms of latitude, and you can see that the far north of the UK is actually at a similar latitude to parts of Norway and Sweden. So we get a lot of daylight in the summer. For my areas, around 16 to 17 hours of daylight, and in the winter that drops to around 8 hours. But when you compare to areas of North America, for example, we're actually at a similar latitude to Calgary in Alberta in Canada. So in fact, the most southerly tip of the UK mainland is still further north than the US-Canadian border. It's only the Scilly Isles and the Channel Islands that are further south. So this does mean we have a lot of variation in terms of where the sun rises and sets, and also how high noon is, and that obviously impacts the level of solar generation. So the following set of charts, which viewers of previous videos will recognise already, but they show the position of sunrise and sunset relative to my house, and the length of the solar day, and also how high the sun rises at noon. So for my location, in January, the sun rises in the southeast and sets in the southwest, and if we take the midpoint of the month, the sun rises at 8:21 in the morning and sets at 16:17 in the afternoon, which gives us 8 hours and 21 minutes of daylight, and the sun doesn't get higher than 17 degrees above the horizon. By the time we get to mid-March, nearly early spring, we have the sun now rising in the east and setting in the west, and we have 10 hours of daylight, with sunrise being at 6:11 in the morning and the sun setting at 18:01, and at noon the sun now gets to 35 degrees above the horizon. Once we get to the height of summer in mid-June, the sun is now rising at 4:39 in the morning, and it sets around 21:15 in the evening, giving us 16 hours and 36 minutes of daylight. And sunrise is now from the northeast, and the sunset is now from the northwest, and the sun at noon gets to 62 degrees above the horizon. But by the time we get to September, and when summer's fading, we're now back to the sun rising in the east and setting in the west, with sunrise at 6:30 and sunset at 19:11. This means that our hours of daylight are now shortening again, so for this month, at this point, it's 12 hours and 45 minutes of daylight, and the sun only gets to 41 degrees above the horizon. And by the time we're back to winter in December, the sun is once again rising in the southeast and setting in the southwest, with less than 8 hours of daylight, with sunrise being at 7:56 in the morning and setting at 16:17. And the sun at midday is only getting to 17 degrees above the horizon. So I was confident that we would have enough solar generation over the course of the year to justify the expense of installing the system. So in the spring of 2022, I registered my interest with our local Solar Together scheme, which is a UK nationwide scheme with a number of local councils throughout the UK. And once Solar Together selected a supplier, I received my quote, initially for solar panels just on the west pitch of the roof with battery storage. However, given that I knew that we do get the sun on the east pitch in the morning, and particularly early on during the height of the summer, I elected to add an additional set of solar panels on the east pitch, and this was our installed system. So we have 16 Trina 385 watt solar panels, 9 panels on the west facing roof, 7 panels on the east facing roof, which gives us a total installed solar capacity of 6.16 kilowatts. We also have 5 pylon batteries with a total storage capacity of 12 kilowatts, and that's all managed through a Solis 5G inverter. And this is just a clear diagram form of that installation as well. So you can see the panels on both pitches and the connectivity into the range inverter, and then ultimately into the batteries and all the requisite isolators that need to be installed as well. The installers forecast that our reduction of grid import would be around 60%, which, as you can see, that equated to a reduction of £1,417 based on our then current tariff projected against the previous year's usage of 6.3 megawatt hours in terms of grid import, and that was forecast to be £2,363 based on our then current tariff. So on that basis, our return on our investment should have been around 9 to 10 years, and that was before we would see any summer generation, and also our move to a tariff that paid us for our export of excess solar generation back to the grid. Now, this is a conservative estimate by the installer, and there are some other considerations as well that could improve that performance. So this graph is our solar generation over the course of the 12 months from our installation in September 2022. The yellow bars that are on the left axis are the amount of kilowatt hours generated daily, while the orange line, which is from the right axis, are the number of hours of daylight per day. And as to be expected, the longer the solar day is, the more generation is seen, and vice versa. Our best day for solar generation was the 4th of June, where we generated 40 kilowatt hours of solar energy. Our worst day was the 4th of December, exactly 6 months earlier, ironically, where we only generated 100 watts. And if we take a look at the same data but on a monthly basis, you can see that June was the best for solar generation with 938 kilowatt hours of electricity generated, and December was the worst month at 83 kilowatt hours. July and August were disappointing, but that is solely down to the weather, as we have had a particularly wet summer in the UK after June. But in total for the year, we generated 5.4 megawatt hours of electricity. So let's take a closer look at the best day that we saw. So that was the 4th of June, and we can see on the SolisCloud dashboard that it was a pretty clear sky all day, because there's no really big drops in the generation, which may indicate that it was cloudy. So of the 39.8 kilowatt hours or 40 kilowatt hours that were generated, we used 14.7 kilowatt hours directly from the panels, sent 7.7 kilowatt hours to the batteries, and we exported 17.5 kilowatt hours back to the grid. And of the battery storage, we used 10.9 kilowatt hours. And on the flip side, if we look at our worst day of the year, and that was the 4th of December, and you can see there was little generation at all on that day. As you remember, it was 100 watts that we generated in total. There was also limited data as well, because this was due to an issue with our inverter and batteries, which we'll come to shortly. So next, let's take a look at our electricity usage split between grid import, battery usage, solar usage and grid export from the entire year. You can very clearly see from April onwards the grid import in blue is minimal, and that is when our main volume of energy export also starts. Interestingly, exactly 6 months earlier is where the solar generation really falls away during October. You can also see here the real impact of not having the batteries working between mid-November through to the end of January, and in this period our import costs went through the roof, and as a result we still don't really know how our system performs in the middle of winter. And that battery failure really did impact us. As you can see from the screenshot, we had a number of alerts from the 19th of November, and on the SolisCloud app we had alarms advising current leakage, then a succession of CAN, COM fail and un-VBAT error messages, both on the app and by email. Also, we would typically see that should the battery drop below 20% full, there'll be a charge of the battery to take it back over 20%, and that process then stopped. And then finally, on the weekend of the 19th and 20th, we started to see that the battery would just continue discharge and not recharge during the day from the solar panel until it actually drained the batteries completely. Ultimately, we found that it was an over-the-air battery update that caused the issue, and a number of customers had similar issues. If the comments I got at the time were anything to go by, the resolution in the end was that we had an engineer from our installers performing a complete recommission of the batteries and updated the firmware on the batteries. And given that I'm now seeing the performance of the system in September and October of this year, 2023, comparing that to this time last year, I'm of the opinion that the batteries were not working correctly from the outset, as there is a marked difference in performance around solar energy utilisation, particularly in September. And we'll take a look at that in the review for September 2023. Once the batteries were reinstalled and updated, our savings for February were 3 times that we'd saved in January. And while obviously winter will have an impact on solar generation, not being able to store that excess energy from the solar panels meant that our bills were higher. Our total house usage in February was 640 kilowatt hours, and that was only 10 kilowatt hours less than January even, and obviously this is the shortest month of the year. But our electricity bill turned out to be £68 cheaper because we could store the energy rather than losing it to a grid for a much smaller benefit in terms of the payments for grid export. And if we take a look at that data again in terms of electricity usage split between grid import, battery usage, solar usage and grid export, but on a month by month basis, June was obviously our best month, where 97% of our electricity came from solar generation, either directly from the panels or from the battery storage. And it was also the month where we had our highest volume of energy export, with 385 kilowatt hours being sent back to the grid. December was our worst month, with only 11% of our energy from the solar panels and battery storage, although that figure may be skewed with our battery issues last year. And indeed, I feel that November through to January are probably not reflective of the system's performance due to that issue. So if we move to looking at our split of energy usage between solar generated power and grid import, between the 1st of April and the 31st of August, so over a period of 5 months, we averaged a daily split where 92% of our energy was directly from solar generation and 8% was grid import, which is amazing. Again, between mid-November to the end of January, however, I believe that the split between solar and grid import will be skewed just due to the batteries not being in operation, and you can see that we're down to low 20% in terms of solar generation or lower. So yeah, that's the differential that we're seeing for the year, and it'd be interesting to see for this winter whether that changes and we see more solar utilisation. But if we take a look at our best day for solar utilisation over the past 12 months, the 11th of June, we actually generated 35 kilowatt hours of electricity. We used 9.5 kilowatt hours and sent 5.5 kilowatt hours back to the battery. And we actually only imported 9 watts from the grid. So for this date, our power was 100% solely from our solar generation. And finally, we have the same annual data in terms of solar utilisation, but again grouped by month. So as you can see, June, as has been the case throughout the whole of this video, was our best month. 97% of our energy came directly from the panels or from the battery storage. Yeah, probably the question that everyone wants to know. Let's take a look firstly at our grid import over the course of the last 4.5 years. As you can see, we typically used between 400 and 600 kilowatt hours per month, although that has now gone up to between 600 and 700 kilowatt hours per month since I started working from home permanently, and obviously during the lockdown periods when everybody was at home. But the key point on this chart is the orange line showing our reduction in usage compared to the projected import if the solar and battery installation had not taken place. And our grid import costs have plummeted, as you'd expect, especially once the battery issues between November and January were resolved. Again, you can see over the 4.5 years, our costs were typically between £50 and £100 per month, and then increased significantly once the wholesale energy price rocketed during 2022. Had we not had the solar panel and battery installation in place, we would have seen our grid import costs being around £200 to £250 a month, and certainly not the £30 on average that we've seen since the beginning of April. So, for the year, we have generated 5.4 megawatt hours of electricity from the panels, using 2.8 megawatt hours directly, stored 1.8 megawatt hours in the batteries, and sent 1.3 megawatt hours back to the grid. For grid import, we imported 3.2 megawatt hours, meaning that for the year, 59% of our energy usage was solar and 41% was imported from the grid. And we averaged around 600 to 700 kilowatt hours of electricity usage per month, either from the panels, from the batteries, or directly from the grid. In terms of savings, by my calculations, we've made £1,493.87 of savings just by reducing our grid import, which increases to £1,614.58 if you factor in the payments of £120.71 for our grid import. And as we pay both our gas and electricity bill monthly based on actual usage rather than estimates, this has also meant that we've built up a credit in the current account that our bills are paid from. So as we get into winter and the bills go up, we should have a few months of payments already set aside. Our solar panel installers forecast that our reduction of grid import would be around 60% of our typical usage, so we are near enough bang on that forecast for the first year. But as I've mentioned already, winter is still an unknown due to the issues we saw on the batteries last year, so next year may see a better return. Our cost savings were also pretty much on the money, as well as our export estimates. But we have generated nearly 800 kilowatt hours more than we'd estimated. And in terms of payback, the installers originally said 9 to 10 years, but on the first year, in terms of savings made, I calculate that this install will actually pay for itself in under 9 years. And considering we had problems in the winter and summer was a washout from July onwards, I think we could see that target move even earlier. However, it should be noted that the increase in wholesale costs, particularly around gas, which actually drives our energy unit price in the UK, means our cost savings increased as the typical bill increased. Now we're seeing the unit cost of electricity slowly drop. That will have an impact on the cost savings that we see, although the savings are still significant. And finally, if we take a look at the payback in terms of the total cost of the system, that was £13,936.19. And with the savings that we've made over the course of the year and the export payments received, by my calculations, we've paid back essentially 11% of the total cost in the first year. So that was our review of the first 12 months. On the whole, I think we're in a good place. We've seen some issues, but the performance of the system overall is encouraging, and it'll be interesting to see how the next 12 months play out. Next on the channel will be our September and October reviews, and now that we have a full year of data, we can start to compare performance against previous years as we go through the monthly reviews. As always, let me know in the comments below if there's anything else you'd like to see, and if you found this video useful, please do like and subscribe, and I'll see you for the next one.